good evening, and welcome. Tonight, we're going to be discussing the history and geography of South Korea. I've got the new atlas out to show you this big old huge map of South Korea. So, apologize if the angle's a little weird, because I wanted to show you this big pretty map, because in my old atlas, South Korea was like this big. So, this is much better. So we'll discuss geography, we'll discuss history, and then we'll flip through this book and look at the pretty pictures inside. So, quick notes beforehand. If you're new to my channel, welcome. Thank you for clicking on this video. I'm not going to pressure you into giving me a like or anything just yet, but do stick around and consider subscribing, because I post every day. And I'm going to have a whole big series on South Korea coming up. Lots of book flip-throughs, soft-spoken whisper videos. And I'm going to do a video all about Hangul, which is the Korean alphabet in a sense. So subscribe so you won't miss out. And for my current subscribers, welcome back. I did take a little break, sort of unannounced. It's just a very busy time of year, very stressful. If you can't tell by my nails, it's the holiday season, and I'm working retail now, and it's very stressful, especially since it's 2020 right now. It's a lot, so I was just a little overwhelmed, and I took a break from a few things actually, and this channel was one of them, so I'm slowly getting my groove back, and I'm happy to be back. Plus my new computer is finally on the way, so I'm excited. I can edit a little easier, I hope, once that comes in. So anyway, thanks for sticking around while I was gone for a little bit, but I should be back to normal now. So without further ado, South Korea, which I'm really excited for this because I have to admit, I'll confess, some of you who know me in real life already know, but I'm one of those weird K-pop people. And yes, I know I'm a little older. I'm probably too old to listen to K-pop, but I've been listening to it for almost 10 years now. It was 2011 when I clicked on Hyuna's Bubble Pop video, because it was on the front page of YouTube, and haven't looked back. Gone into it with 21 and Big Bang in 2014, and been sticking with it ever since. So I like it more than regular music. And I've got my Blackpink light stick out because I love Blackpink. So this is a light stick that you light up. You wave it around at concerts to cheer them on, and it is very squeaky. I won't do it because it's kind of loud. But this is for the girl group Blackpink. Them and Twice are my favorite girl groups right now. My favorite active girl groups, I should say. Them and Red Velvet. I'm what we call in the K-pop world, I'm a multi-stan, which means I don't just pick one or two groups. I love all of them. I love all K-pop. I love BTS. I'm really getting into Stray Kids lately. I'm really enjoying them. Day 6 I really like. It's a very long list of groups that I really like. Mamamoo I really love. Yeah, it's a long list, but getting into K-pop, you start learning Korean, so I can speak it pretty well. I can read it fluently, which we'll discuss in my video about Hangul. So, put this out the way. There we go. That being said, I'm really excited to talk about South Korea. So let's just dive right in and start talking about geography. So it's kind of hard to see on this map because it's really more political, but there is lots of geography listed on here. So most of South Korea is actually extremely mountainous. There's lots and lots of big mountain ranges, more specifically the Taebak and the Sopak mountain ranges. And by mountains, like technically, yes, they are mountains, but they're not like giant, like Rocky Mountains, Himalayan mountains, anything. Mountains nonetheless, but nothing like astronomical. The biggest mountain is actually down here on Jeju Island. There's Hara-san. Jeju Island is pretty much considered like the Hawaii of South Korea. It's a pretty tropical climate, like not tropical, but much more tropical than the rest of South Korea. It has gorgeous beaches, it has the mountains. It's like the vacation spot of South Korea. And as you can tell by looking at it, it is its largest island. South Korea has hundreds of islands all around its coast. There's one, can you see? Yep, right over there. There's over there, which you can see is disputed with Japan, but that's a whole thing. We might touch into the whole Korea versus Japan thing, but I don't want to get too into it because it's really messy and not relaxing, and this is a relaxation video. But there are some debates over who actually owns a few of the islands, whether they belong to South Korea or Japan. Both sides claim that they own it. But yes, many islands. Most of them are uninhabited, but Jeju is the most populated, most special of all the islands, for sure. It's definitely a place I want to go someday because it's like where the native Koreans go on vacation, so it's where I'd like to go on vacation someday. And of course, the capital city up here is Seoul, which I say with the accent, it's Seoul in my Californian accent, but it's pronounced Seoul in Korean. The major city here. But South Korea is full of really major cities. It's a very urban country. There's lots of countryside, of course. I think every country has some countryside to some capacity, but considering that South Korea is very mountainous, has this huge coastline, and with its industries being very commercialized, very industrialized, they produce a lot of electronics, cars, chemicals, things of that nature. They're not really known for exporting a lot of farming fruits, although they are famous for their foods, believe me. Who doesn't love bulgogi? And of course kimchi being the most famous South Korean delicacy, I suppose. Not delicacy, but just what people eat in Korea. Everyone associates kimchi with South Korea, or Korea in general. But their best known export is of electronics, cars, cell phones, things like that. And then of course there's the media, with South Korean entertainment being probably their biggest export in a sense, with music, drama, TV shows, dramas, and movies being the height of popularity around the world, South Korea's never seen before, with Parasite, a South Korean film, winning Best Picture at the Oscars, with South Korean dramas being huge all over Asia, in Japan, in China, Vietnam, all over Asia, and now all over the world. Now you can watch Korean dramas on Netflix. Netflix is making their own Korean dramas, things like that. And then of course K-pop has just reached unheard of levels. It's so strange, having been a fan since I want to say I remember my first big release I was excited for was The Boys by Girls' Generation, and how hyped I was. And they had an appearance on was it David Letterman, and I was like, wow, K-pop's really gonna make it someday. But I think it was David, I don't remember, but I would have never dreamed that K-pop would be as huge as it is now at all. South Korea has come a very long way in terms of its economy, its media, its entertainment, its exports, its culture. Honestly, it's really incredible how so many people have become so interested in just this little peninsula. But probably the most important aspect of South Korean geography is right up here at the border, which I had to make sure I had to get in frame because it is the most important aspect of South Korea, is the DMZ, or the Demilitarized Zone, which is about 1.5 miles of no man's land that separates South Korea from North Korea. It's very, very heavily patrolled by soldiers on both ends, making sure that no one gets across. And obviously we're going to talk more about that in the history, but like I said, it's one of the most, probably the most important aspect of South Korean political geography, besides the islands, I think, and the capital. So apparently, since they're running out of space here in the capital, they're starting to build another capital city, I think like out here somewhere. And it's going to be just like the government buildings, and it's going to be the new official capital. And then Seoul is just going to be like residential. And it's set to be completed in about 2030. So that's interesting, I think. I know they've done that in like Brazil. I mentioned that in my Myanmar video. They did it there as well. So we'll see how that goes. So without further ado, let's get into its history and learn how it got to be this way, how it got to be split, and how it got to be so huge and prosperous. So, South Korea as we know it today, or just Korea in general, I should say, the whole peninsula, really got its start in the year 2333 BCE. And we know this exact date. It comes from a very exact text, because as we're going to hear in a little bit, they had a really flourishing publishing industry in its early history. There are a lot of like history books written about it. So there's a lot from China and Korea about ancient Korea. So the first country that came about on the peninsula was originally called Joseon, but in historical context it's now known as Go-Joseon, which means like old Joseon. You'll see why later. They controlled, you can't really see the rest of the peninsula up here because I had to get all of South Korea in frame, but they controlled the peninsula and parts of China. Let me find a map in here. Maybe you can find a better zoomed out version of South Korea. Let's see, there's always a map in here. No, that's not that great either. I'll show you a map in a second, a better map of ancient Korea. Because Go-Joseon, as thriving as it was in ancient times, was conquered and controlled by ancient China. Now, disclaimer, we're going to talk about China a lot in this video. And China went through a lot of changes over history. It was not always known as China. It was conquered by many different people. It had many different dynasties and rulers and conquerors and what have you. But for the sake of time and for the sake of this condensed history, this is going to be a very, very short, just to the point history of South Korea. I'm just going to say China. So at this point, it wasn't China. It was the people who were living in what we now know as China. So just go with that. I think that's just like the easiest way to understand it from like a beginner's perspective, so I don't have to be like, oh, Tang Dynasty, Ming Dynasty, Mongol controlled, or People's Republic of China, Communist China, and so on and so forth, you know. Just China. Straightforward. So, back to ancient times. Gojoseon was conquered and controlled by China. And they weren't really interested in absorbing it. They just set it up as like a trade center. It was split into many different like factions of a kingdom. And 3 of those weakened and fell apart, and the royal families fled south to this region that we now know as South Korea, and established 3 new kingdoms. And these 3 kingdoms were known as Goguryeo, Baekje, and Sierra. And I'm going to show you a map of that. So this book I'm going to read to you tomorrow. And it has a really good map of the 3 kingdoms in it. Let's see, I think it's in the next chapter. Yeah. Okay, so here's a good picture. So here's the peninsula, right? Just picture that whenever I talk about the peninsula. I'm going to say that a lot. And this region up here, you see as China, is more commonly known in its history as Manchuria. It's not known as that until like the 1700s, 1800s. So I'm just calling that for the sake of calling it that. But here's the 3 kingdoms at the height of their powers at the 3 Kingdoms era. 3 Kingdoms era was like the earlier CE. So, oh yeah, here we go. 300 to 350 CE. So this big one up here is Goguryeo. And each kingdom had their own little claim to fame. So Goguryeo was that they were the biggest. They were the mightiest. They had the biggest military. They were the strongest politically, physically. They had the most land. They wound up conquering what was left of Gojoseon and absorbing it. So that was the end of Gojoseon. The second one here is Baekje. And a lot of historians call them the Phoenicians of the Far East. If you don't know your ancient peoples, the Phoenicians were big into trading over the sea in boats. So the people of Baekje built lots of boats and traded with the Chinese, the other kingdoms, and with Japan, most notably. Baekje is how Buddhism got into the peninsula, because they traded with other countries and, started integrating Buddhism. And they're the ones that brought Buddhism to Japan, or the Yayoi, I think they were at the time, in this time period. So they're the ones responsible for that. So they were really into like trade, shipbuilding, and like spreading the knowledge that they'd gained through their trades. And the third and final one is Sierra. And Sierra's claim to fame is that they were really into like the arts and sciences and learning, education, culture, music, things like that. They were very educated, very I don't want to say intelligent. They were like the Ravenclaws of the 3 kingdoms. They were like the smarties. So these little dots you see are dolmens. They were burial mounds, and they still exist to this day. So the capital of Goguryeo was Pyongyang up there. The capital of Baekje was Gwangju, and the capital of Sierra was Busan, right there. So just going off of this map, which do you think absorbed the other 2? Was it the big, strong, powerful one? The one with lots of trades, or the ones with lots of culture? Surprisingly, it was the tiny one with lots of culture, Sierra. Because Because what they did was that they wound up having lots of ties with China. They became like political besties. And with their influence, they managed to conquer the other two kingdoms and absorb them. Pretty much up to about here-ish. Pretty much to where like the border of North Korea is today, around there. So they basically wound up conquering the whole peninsula around 676. And it was known as the Unification of the Three Kingdoms, or Unified Sira. There was one other kingdom up here known as Barhe. And Barhe was established by a Goguryeo general who fled. And not much is known about them because they didn't keep any kind of written history, written record. All that we know about them was what the Chinese and the people of Sira wrote about them later on. So if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't know that Barhe even existed. A lot of their artifacts are gone. So we really don't know much about them other than they were there. I'm going to put this away. You guys see the concept there. So under Unified Sira, they really thrived. It's going to be a theme. The culture really took off in terms of sciences, arts, music, all of those wonderful, rich cultural aspects. And it really didn't fall apart until, it ended in 936. And it ended due to revivalist movements of Baekje and Goguryeo. It sort of crumbled from the inside out, slowly but surely. It lasted for about 300 years. And the kingdom split apart and were reunited once again under the name Goryeo. So it was like the revivalist Goguryeo, right? So this was like new Goguryeo. It's just called Goryeo. And so the Chinese, of course, wrote about Goryeo, but they wrote it in their dialect, their writing, which is Goryeo. And then that spread throughout Asia, right? Korea, Korea, which is how we get the name Korea today, is from the name Goryeo. So, Goryeo is established in 936, and again, it also thrives. This is where we get the printing press, which is really interesting to me because me being an American in my European history class in high school, learning that the printing press was invented by Johann Gutenberg, and that books weren't around until then, and that the only books that were ever published were Bibles for hundreds of years. They had printing presses in the 1000s, 1100s here in the Korean Peninsula, and they had whole libraries of Buddhist works that are still around today. It's incredible, honestly, the technological advances that they had. But good times always come to an end, thanks to the Mongols. The Mongols are going to come up in pretty much any video about Asia or the Middle East. They will come up every single time. So around the 13th century, the Mongols come knocking at their door. And they attempt to invade and fail, actually. But it does leave the kingdom extremely weak, to the point where they have to go to the Mongols, who were reigning in China at the time, and Kublai Khan was their leader, and they had to swear allegiance to them in order to sustain their country. So Goryeo was allowed to continue, but they were now a tributary ally to the Mongols. They had to, pay tribute, and they intermarried the royal families of the Mongols and the Koreans for many, many years, for many generations, until 1392, when there was a coup led by General Yi Sung-ye. He took over the country, moved the capital to what is now Seoul, and changed the name of the country to Joseon, after what it was originally called during its times of antiquity. Which is why back then we call it Gochoseon, because now we have Joseon. And once again, we have thriving cultures once again, I should say. A couple of big changes during this era. Neo-Confucianism is established as the official religion. So Confucianism was around in a big way during this time. There are lots of schools for people to study Confucianism, but Buddhism was still like the de facto religion, especially in Unified Siro. They built beautiful Buddhist temples during that time. But Confucianism became the big important one at this time, because Confucianism was mostly applied to everyday life, because it dictated how you acted toward like your family members and people you worked for, and it's all about like do unto others and so on and so forth. So it's not so much about like praying to gods and what have you. It's about how you should live your everyday life. So Confucian aspects are still a major part of everyday life in a lot of Asian cultures, especially East Asian cultures, especially in South Korea. So that forcing implementing Neo-Confucianism greatly changed how South Koreans live their lives. The other big important thing in 1447 was King Sejong the Great created the Hangul alphabet, so that everyone in South Korea could read, because they didn't have their own written language. They were using Chinese characters till then. But like I said, I'll go more into detail about that when I do a whole video about Hangul. It's the neatest written language. It's literally invented to be easy to learn. It's great. But again, all good things must come to an end. Like I very briefly mentioned in my History of Japan video, because it's interesting how like a tiny half sentence in my History of Japan video completely changes the entire history of this whole country, right? So in 1592 and 1598, Japan attempts to invade Korea. Toyotomi Hideyoshi attempts to take over because he just conquered Japan. He had a great idea. So he conquered the peninsula. Short abrupt version. He didn't make it, however. The Joseon had support from China, so they never fully invaded the peninsula. But it left Joseon incredibly weak after those two massive invasions, which left the door open for the Manchus, which were like a quote-unquote like barbarian sort of Chinese tribal people to invade, which they attempted to do in 1627 and 1637. It was also unsuccessful, not as unsuccessful as the Japanese, but unsuccessful nonetheless. And it left Joseon even more weaker than it was before. So they really went to China for help, because they were wrecked basically, geographically, economically, so on and so forth. They just suffered these horrible invasion attempts. So China was basically helping to keep them afloat for the longest time. And as the world was advancing all around them, Korea, I should say, Joseon, what have you, was always lacking behind because of these huge setbacks, because they always owed China, China, like I'm saying. Eventually, skipping way ahead, in about the 18th, like mid-18th century, they adopted an isolationist movement. They cut off all trade with everyone in the world except China, just to try to avoid imperialism, to avoid Western influence. They were very anti-Christian, anti-Catholic, to the point where they were removing anyone from their borders who believed that way. Just the relaxing way to say that. It's very horrible what they did, but that's what happened. And they stayed that way for a long time. And slowly but surely, Japan wiggled itself in, which means the United States slowly wiggled itself in. And so exceptions started happening. So we're now in like the late 1800s, early 1900s. Japan is modernizing. They're going through the Meiji Restoration. They're building up their military, becoming this huge might. China is also building up their military. Russia, they're extremely powerful force. Always have been, probably always will be. And here's the Korean Peninsula right in the middle. So, being surrounded by these superpowers, it was really inevitable that someone would come swallow them up. There were a few wars fought between these three countries over a few things, but including who should control the peninsula. Japan wound up winning, and long story short, controversial story short, debatable story short, Japan wound up taking control of Korea and wound up annexing the country to Japan in 1910. Now, the circumstances about all that are, I'll just say that there are a lot, and it's something I'm not going to get into. We're just going to accept the facts and move on. Also, Japan's occupation of Korea was horrific, to say the least. From a small perspective, the best of the worst things they did was that they tried to eliminate aspects of Korean culture by not allowing people to speak Korean, write in Korean. It was Japanese only. Not wear traditional Korean clothes, changing their names from Korean names to Japanese names, just trying to erase their culture. It got a lot worse from there. And this is a relaxation channel, right? So we're not going to get into it. And some of those things that the Japanese did to these people, there are some people that deny that they happened. And I am not one of those people. Let me say that up front. I'm not going to go into what it was, because it was horrifying and tragic and very heartless, and I 1000% believe the survivors of these incidents. And I can't imagine. I'm just not going to get into it, but I'm just saying that I acknowledge that these things happened, and I grieve for those who suffered through it, and my heart goes out to them, and I believe them, and I'm absolutely not coming from a place of ignoring or setting aside. Sorry, the rooster started crowing, but it's really early in the morning. But yeah, I recognize those things happened. I am horrified for the victims. I acknowledge it, and we're gonna just move on with the history and continue to relax. That's the best I can do right now. There's still roosters crowing in the distance, but oh well. As long as my landlady's rooster doesn't crow, that's all that matters. Anyway, there was a very famous revolt against the Japanese in 1919. But the Japanese military and police fought back, and many hundreds lost their lives, many more hundreds were injured. The Koreans really didn't stand a chance against this very mighty, powerful military force. Until, of course, World War II, when Japan bit off a little bit more than it could chew and lost the war. So, here's what happens, right? It's the United States that defeated Japan and occupied Japan. But it's Russia that invaded the peninsula from the north to rescue the Koreans. So both superpowers technically have a right to control the peninsula. So who's gonna, help this country get back on its feet? The communist Russians or the democratic Americans, who are kind of frenemies, they're on the same sides of the war, but have very opposing political ideas and don't want to see the other country implement another country of their ideals. So they agree to just split the country in two, right along the 30th parallel, and just, for about 5 years or so, until they could figure out what to do. But they never can figure out what to do. The South side, the one that we're concerned with tonight, hold a presidential election. They elect a man named Seung-min to be president. And then in North Korea, they set up a full-blown communist dictatorship. But we're going to get into that whenever we get to North Korea in my video series. So put a pin in that for whenever we get to that. Eventually, Russia and the United States just agree to disagree. They withdraw and just decide to let the Koreans figure themselves out, which doesn't quite work out because on, what day was it? It was June 25th, 1950. The North Koreans invaded South Korea. Very scary. It sparks the Korean War, which, of course, the South Koreans are backed by the Americans and their allies. The North Koreans are backed by Russia and China, many of their allies. And it's a very evenly matched war. No side is winning or losing. It's perfectly matched. So in 1953, both sides agreed to an armistice. They split the country right down the middle here. Decide that there's just going to be two countries, although both countries don't recognize the other politically. None of, anyone from North Korea cannot cross this border to South Korea, vice versa. Families were split in half. And technically the war is not over. It's just in a ceasefire. So the military draft is still ongoing. Any man under 30 must enlist in the military for, I know they just changed it because of COVID, but I know it was 2 years. I think now it's like a year and some change, like some months. So that if anything does happen and the fighting starts up, then they have a military ready to go. So understandably, any kind of political agenda is going to be about unification, because ultimately that's the goal that every Korean, North or South, really wants, is to unify the country once again and make one Korea. So whenever there's a new leader, they always kind of say, my goal is to unify the country first and foremost, and blah, 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 blah. They make political promises, but they always run on a platform of unification. And then something always happens, and it's never really the case. So, without going into too many details about the tangled web of South Korean politics, because I honestly find it really interesting, I'm just going to try to sum it up. So, let's start with Syngman Rhee, the first president. He actually was exiled. He started to implement some kind of dictator-like qualities. He started changing up the constitution, changing up some of the laws, allowing himself more terms as president, kind of, getting his foot in the door of, setting himself up as president for life, which there were massive protests against him. especially, the biggest one in 1960 was what led him to flee the country. He fled to Hawaii. The government that replaced him was particularly weak, so a coup overthrew that, led by Park Chung-hee. He became the new president, and the one very good thing he did promise to do, was to completely overhaul the economy, and that he did. It was known as the Miracle on the Han River, which I'm now realizing I didn't talk about rivers when I talked about geography. The Han River flows through Seoul, so he's the one responsible for completely flipping the whole economy of South Korea on its head, setting up the concept of exporting quality exports, basically, like electronics, chemicals, things we know today, like Hyundai cars, LG, the typical Korean manufactured goods. The economy boomed, and it honestly saved South Korea, made it into what it is today. However, he was honestly a military dictator, and was definitely on the way to becoming a full-on president for life, a full-on dictator, to the point where he was assassinated in 1979 by his own CIA. Also in 1979, the Coup D'etat by General Chun Tu-hwan. He also made some grand promises about unification, what have you, but his very controversial changes to the government sparked mass protests. He declared martial law, like a super strict martial law, that just sparked even more protests. It culminated in what is known as the Guangzhou Massacre, where you can kind of figure out what that means. Another tragedy that we won't go into, which he was actually convicted for and sent to prison for. Things didn't really start looking up for South Korea until 1988. Most South Koreans consider that to be the turning point in history, where things finally started going good, which is really highlighted in the drama Reply 1988. But anyway, 1988 was the year that Seoul hosted the Olympics, so that was like the big, change. And then, the 90s were the 90s. I think most, like, Western, this isn't technically a Western country, but it is a democratic one, saw a economic boom during that time. Economic growth, economic prosperity. In the year 2000, the president at the time actually really started pushing forward for unification, in what was known as the Sunshine Policy, which in a nutshell was like love bombing North Korea, just letting them know that, love and peace, and it actually kind of worked. There were a lot of improvements in relations with North Korea. They started running trains across the DMZ. There were some moments where families that were separated were allowed to meet, but now it was happening a lot more often. The two leaders were meeting more often. And there were, lots of little baby steps towards unification, but honestly, I don't think unification is going to happen in our lifetime. I think it will happen one day. I'm optimistic for that, but I don't think it's going to happen in our lifetime. But there are definite baby steps, toddler steps toward unification happening currently. The best one being in 2017. It was like the end of 2017, I want to say. 2018. I think the end of 2017. And there were lots of, very, very good peace talks between South Korea and North Korea, with the two leaders, actually crossing across the DMZ stepping over the line, and then the other one stepped over their line, which had like never happened ever since that line was set. So, you know, it's a little bit sure, but not anytime soon. The most, I think, important part, I would say, of modern South Korean politics would be Park Geun-hye, who's actually the daughter of Park Chung-hee. She was the first, and only so far, female president of South Korea, the first female leader of any East Asian country. And did I say 2013? Did I say that? In 2013. And it was like a big moment, of course, because, you know, anytime any female leader is placed for the first time in any position of power anywhere in the world, it's a big deal. However, she wound up being incredibly corrupt, it turns out. Especially exposed during the Sewa ferry disaster, which, another tragedy that I won't get too into, but basically a ferry traveling to Jeju Island that mostly held high schoolers on a field trip sank. And the Coast Guard response, the rescue effort, and the political response was abhorrent, inexcusable, and just it's a tragedy on so many levels, from what happened to those poor children to the recovery efforts, the response to the disaster, and the fallout from it. It's all horrifying. It's my heart aches for those families, those parents. But it opened the door to investigating President Park, and wound up uncovering rampant corruption. And she was impeached in 2017. So it's really sad that, you know, we had this moment of, you know, the first female president, but yikes, you know. So that's pretty much the history of South Korea as we are today in 2020. I'm not trying to debate if I want to add anything else, because, you know, COVID is a thing. You know, I feel like South Korea is one of those countries that responded really well to the virus, but they're dealing with their own second wave, maybe a third wave even. I feel like a lot of East Asian countries are dealing with that. But let's not talk about that. Let's go through the book. That's always the best part. Let's flip through. I haven't flipped through this in a little bit, so let's see what we've got. Very beautiful topics. Let me try to angle this, because I have this book at an angle, so that it's a little easier for you to see. Dynamic Korea. It's Busan. And, so this is the trains that go across the DMZ. And here's the political map of South Korea. Farmer in a rice field. Of course, rice is an incredibly important crop in South Korea. The mountains near Guangzhou. So this is what a traditional or typical Korean table looks like when people eat. You don't just have one plate to yourself. You would have like your own like rice bowl or kimchi. And then all the dishes are placed in the table and everyone just shares the table. That's how you eat a meal in Korea. Here's the South Korean soccer team. So in 2002, South Korea and Japan co-hosted the FIFA World Cup. I guess I didn't get into all the South Korea-Japan stuff, did I? That's okay. It's really depressing. This must be Jeju Island. Yes, I know that they have lots of these beautiful rocky jagged cliffs off the coastline. Look how beautiful. Because it's all very volcanic. Here is Soraksan Mountain. beautiful jagged rocky mountains they have there. Here's the Han River flowing through Seoul. A physical map of South Korea where you can see, you see what I mean by mountainous. It's almost all mountains in the center. All the big mountains throughout. Here's Seoul, and here's part of, which city is it? South Korea's western coast is Daecheon Beach near Boryong City, where they have this mud festival. Urando, little island. It's this island right there. Some of the cities. This is Busan. I can tell without looking. Yeah, Busan. It's an iconic beach up there in Busan. Busan is like the, I guess like the Miami of Korea. Or like, what is it? Yeah, like, you know, every country has like, a coastal country, I should say, has like the beach city, you know? So that's Incheon. This is Harasan on Jeju Island. And beautiful cherry blossoms. Plants and animals. More of Jeju Island. I said it's like a big tourist place. An example of the forests. It's very mountainous. So, one part of the aspect that I was talking about, like arts and stuff flourish. Celadon pottery was a big part of the art scene in ancient times. You can see the bamboo art. And here's the Rose of Sharon, their national flower. There's a bear. And a Korean lungless crevice salamander that was discovered in 2003. Here's the red-crowned cranes and the Jindo dog. And this is Soraksan National Park. Very beautiful. Anamchi Pond, part of a castle built during the Kingdom of Sira. This is in Seoul. So this is the Cheonggye Stream. It had been paved over and used as a freeway. Well, we say freeway in California. It's an expressway. But lately, in a way to try to like make the city greener, they uncovered it and revived the river or stream, I guess. So now there's a new little stream flowing through Seoul. This is Cheomdongse, right? Cheomsungdae, I apologize. One of the earliest astronomical observation towers built in Korea. This is Donggun. He's the one that founded Gojoseon back in 2333 BCE. And he came from heaven. Some ceramics from the Three Kingdoms. Here's another map of Goguryeo, Baekje, and a good map of unified Sira. I can turn the page. There we go. It's literally 3 in the morning where there's so many loud cars. Anyway, Burgiksa Temple, built during the Sira era. And this is the Emir Bell in Gyeongju. So many little cars right now. Here's some Celadon pottery. And a Buddhist painting. Timeline of the Korean governments. Joseon Dynasty. See the Mongol invasions, the Japanese invasions. The turtle ships. So this was seen as one of the successes of, or I should say, start the sentence over. This was seen as one of the reasons why Korea were successful in their, man, I can't talk. what am I trying to say? This is how Japan lost their invasion. The turtle ships. So these ships, and I really can't talk. These ships stopped the Japanese invasion. There we go. We got it out. You can see they're fully covered. They could, stick weapons out and fire. Fully protected. The turtle ships. Here's a painting showing the Koreans trading with the Imperial Japanese. And it's a picture of Busan. Japanese soldiers marching into Seoul in 1904. And let's see, Japanese police officers. Pearl Harbor being attacked. And crossing into the 38th parallel. You'll see this picture again in a video coming up in a few days about the Korean War. A map of the Korean War, Communist fronts, and United Nations fronts. Here's Sigmund Rhee lounging. Park Chung-hee, who ruled for a long time. And a student demonstration in 1980. So many of the political changes were due to students protesting. Kim Tae-jung. He won the Nobel Peace Prize due to his work with trying to bring peace talks to North Korea. Young democracy, another student protest there. Green flag. And South Korea's political leaders. We have Roh Moo-hyun. There's Park Geun-hye and Ban Ki-moon, who's the Secretary General of the, I'm Californian, Secretary General of the United Nations. My accent slipped out for a second. Here's the South Korean National Assembly, and this is the Blue House. So, like in America, we have the White House. In South Korea, they have the Blue House. Cadets in the Korean military. And here's Kim Jong-il and Kim Tae-jung in 2000. So this is a cool thing about Seoul. So this is one of the original gates to the walls of the city, which has been preserved. It's surrounded by the modern city. And another temple in Seoul. And there's a map of Seoul down there. Oh, it's the National Food Museum. Rice farming. And maybe it's on Jeju Island, it says. Picture of their money, their currency is called the won. And a very old-fashioned rice field, rice paddy. Some octopus. Which, octopus is very delicious, but I could never eat those, like, live octopus. Yuck. You know, another, like, Korean aspect that's really taken off is the mukbangs, which has become its own monster. So here's people taking pictures of that gate I just showed you. And here's the Hyundai factory. Or Hyundai, as we say in America. Korea's high-speed rails. Gyeongbokgung Palace. Oh, where's this? This is Dongri on Urungdo. On the island I pointed out to you, this little island over here. Showing you where people live in Korea. Pretty much everyone lives in the cities in Korea. North Korean refugees bowing in respect. And this is actually in Los Angeles. I've actually been here. The Koreatown in Los Angeles. The Korean neighborhood in Los Angeles. Where I went shopping at the mall for K-pop stuff. Here's King Sejong. 안녕하세요. And here's the Hangul alphabet, which I'll teach you in a few days. So here's a family wearing the traditional Korean clothes. They're called Hanbok. And they're really beautiful and colorful. They look really comfortable too. Korea University. This is, let's see, the Coup D'etat Catholic Church in Unsang, built in 1922. And this is the Tripitaka Koreana, I believe it's called. This is the Buddhist works I told you about that were published on these wood blocks. So here's and over here too, this is a mudang. So ancient shamanism is still practiced in Korea today, not very widely, but it's still there. And it's very much like spirits, ancestors, things like that. Mudang is like the kind of, I guess, priestess, but she like communicates with the spirits of the dead. There's Confucius, and here's some Confucian scholars. And a statue of Siddhartha Gautama, who invented Buddhism, and a beautiful Buddhist temple. Oh, that's Borguksa. That's why it's so beautiful. Turn the page. Here we go. So this is one of the mega churches in Korea. And some Catholic women praying. Pope John Paul II. Catholicism and the Christian faith is really big in Korea. I think it's the highest concentration of Christians in East Asia, and many Catholics were killed in the Joseon period. So there's many Korean martyrs. And then we have the Unification Church, or the Moonies. So it was formed by a man named Sung Myung Moon. I mean, it's a cult. Let's put it that way. This is their most iconic image, is the mass weddings. But recently they've kind of been in the news. They're not as big as they were before, but it's still pretty big. But they're responsible for a lot of COVID super spreader events because it's part of their faith that they have to have these huge meetups and these huge services. So I think the very first Korean super spreader event infected hundreds of people just because one person from this church attended a meeting. Anyway, traditional Korean drum. I forget what it's called. Doesn't say. Thanks. Another celadon. Pottery. Beautiful silk cloth. And the beautiful lanterns that they light for Buddha's birthday. What's this? It says Kim Hong-do was an artist during the Joseon Dynasty. He painted portraits of royalty and landscapes of real scenes throughout the country. That's neat. Oh, look, it's a turtle made out of TVs. Baek Namjoon. This piece is called Turtle. It's modern art. This is the kayagum, the most iconic Korean instrument from ancient times. And some folk dances, the ribbons. It's so beautiful to see. There's Rain, who doesn't really perform anymore. he's kind of grown out of the limelight. He's gotten married and all that. But he just formed his own company, and he has a boy group that's just about to debut. So hopefully they're good. This talks about Boa too, who's a queen, honestly. We love her. Chun Do-yeon, who's like an icon, an actress in Korea. She's amazing. The Jikji printing plates. This is how they would print books and like plates and things in ancient Korea. Taekwondo, of course, is like the beloved martial arts of South Korea. By far, like the biggest sport practiced in South Korea. And as you can see, it's an Olympic event. South Korea in the Olympics. They've hosted the Olympics twice now, in 1988 and 2018. And here's a picture of the World Cup game. Big crowd. I miss that. I miss being a big crowd. Jeju World Cup Stadium that was built for FIFA World Cup. And some hikers climbing up. What is it? Harasan. Very snowy and cold looking. Everyday life. Going through the shopping mall. Korean weddings. Wearing a beautiful hanbok. Of course, these books always have cute kids in them. Look how cute. Very cute. Oh, talk about cute kids. Right? So this outfit is a traditional outfit that kids wear when they turn 1 year old. Or in Korea, their concept of birthdays are really interesting. So they wear this outfit when they reach like a full year of life, I should say, not when they turn 1 year old. And it's called a dol. And they hold a little like ceremony where they put little objects in front of them. And whichever one the kid reaches for determines like what job they'll have in the future. What does it say here? Money means a career in business, while a piece of cake might lead to government service. A length of string points to a long life. A pencil means the child may become a scholar. A musical instrument predicts a future musician. And that's so cute. But, see what's on the next page. Oh, it's food. Yummy. There's kimchi. When you're born, you're already a year old. And at New Year's, you turn another year old. So even if you were born in December, you're 1. And then in January, you're 2. So Korean age is different from like your calendar age. Some apartment buildings. This is how people typically live in the cities in apartments. Gorgeous Hanbok. Korean seesaw, a common game. And gorgeous dancers marking Korean liberation from Japanese colonial rule. And I think that's the last page. Yes, because there's the timeline. And then it's just like where to learn more in the index. So that means we're at the end of the video. So thank you so much for watching. Be sure to stick around because my next, let me look at my calendar. 5 videos are going to be about South Korea. And I'm excited for them. Can't wait for you to see. But thank you so much for watching this one. I hope it was educational and relaxing.